Fostering a culture of vulnerability at work. Abstract. This article discusses the importance of fostering a culture of vulnerability in organizations in order to improve performance and innovation. It explores the research showing that psychological safety, where employees feel comfortable taking risks and admitting weaknesses, leads to better teamwork, problem-solving, and learning. While research demonstrates the benefits of vulnerability, most companies still struggle to create truly psychologically safe cultures. The article then provides practical recommendations for leadership to cultivate vulnerability based on real-world company examples. These include leaders modeling vulnerability, defining clear expectations for respectful engagement, aligning rewards and accountability to encourage risk-taking, and establishing ongoing processes like workshops and reviews that support development from failures and critique. By consciously shaping behaviors, systems, and development opportunities, the article argues leaders can embed vulnerability into the culture in a way that transforms how their organization learns, improves, and competes over the long run. In today's fast-paced and competitive business environment, organizations are starting to recognize the value that comes from cultivating an environment of psychological safety, trust, and openness. However, fostering a culture where vulnerability is embraced remains a challenge for most companies. Today, we will explore the research foundation supporting why organizations should aim to foster cultures of vulnerability, as well as practical steps that leadership can take to encourage vulnerability in their workforce. Research foundation: why vulnerability matters. There is substantial academic research evidencing the performance advantages that stem from fostering cultures of vulnerability in organizations. Professor Amy Edmondson's work established that psychological safety team members' belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking is critical for team learning, problem-solving, and efficiency. Edmondson, 1999. Alternatively, when individuals fear looking ignorant, incompetent, negligent, or hostile in front of others, likelihood of learning and performance drops significantly. Other key findings include: Bren Brown's large-scale research found vulnerability is the only path to meaningful connections with others, creativity, ownership over mistakes, and wholehearted living. Brown, 2018. Google's Project Aristotle identified psychological safety as the defining factor of high-performing teams, even more so than differing skills or backgrounds of team members. Duhigg, 2016. Studies show people are more engaged, committed, and perform better when their leaders model vulnerability. Nembhard and Edmondson, 2006. Walamois et al., 2011. In summary, research consistently shows fostering an environment where people feel safe to admit weaknesses without fear of judgment or retaliation leads to superior learning, problem-solving, innovation, and performance outcomes for organizations. However, achieving true cultures of vulnerability remains challenging for most companies. Fostering vulnerability in practice. The following sections outline practical steps leadership can take, supported by real-world examples, to foster cultures where employees feel secure, bringing their whole selves to work through appropriate levels of respectful vulnerability. Model vulnerability from the top. For employees to feel safe being vulnerable, leaders must role model this behavior first. Researchers have found people are less likely to admit faults or ask for help when their leaders portray themselves as perfect or infallible. Walamois et al. 2011. At Netflix, CEO Reed Hastings established vulnerability as a core leadership competency by openly sharing his limitations and learning from mistakes in company-wide emails. Edmondson, 2019. At Toyota, the top management Genchi Genbutsu approach of personally going to the front lines to observe problems paved the way for admitting failures without fear of embarrassment. Liker, 2004. Healthcare provider Kaiser Permanent fosters physician vulnerability through morbidity and mortality conferences where doctors candidly discuss recent medical errors or complications to collectively learn and improve. Edmondson, 2019. These examples show that leading with honesty and humility from the top is key to enabling vulnerability throughout an organization. Define expectations around vulnerability. For a culture of vulnerability to take root, clear expectations around behavior must be set. Software company GitHub drafted a psychological safety pledge to define respectful engagement and clarify that mistakes will be met with compassion rather than punishment. Duhigg, 2016. At Quest Diagnostics, the laboratory testing company, leadership workshops outline desired behaviors like accepting non-defensiveness, being open to others' perspectives, and separating intent from impact. When giving feedback, Edmondson, 2019, Dutch Bank implemented a code of cooperation encouraging open sharing of ideas and mistakes, without fear of reprisal to foster learning and innovation. Ashkenaz and Janishajevic, 2016. Setting norms and getting buy-in on appropriate vulnerability is crucial for sustainably embedding it in an organization's culture. Align rewards and accountability accordingly. For vulnerability to flourish, incentives and consequences must be structured to support it. At Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund, candor is a core value but also backed by transparent records of everyone's inputs, and an abstention punishment for withholding perspectives. Sinek, 2014. Google directly ties project funding to teams demonstrating high psychological safety, encouraging risk-taking without fear of failure. Duhigg, 2016. Intuit aligns bonuses to transparency around product defects, disclosed to help teams improve faster. Edmondson's, 2019. When people know being vulnerable will be met with support rather than punishments, they will feel more inclined to admit shortcomings. Foster continuous learning and growth. To prevent vulnerability from feeling risky, organizations need processes supporting ongoing development. At IDEO, creativity workshops encourage tentative ideas and criticisms in a non-judgmental space, knowing imperfect work leads to breakthrough innovations. Kelly and Kelly, 2013. Amazon implements post-mortems after product launches to invite vulnerability and collective problem-solving around failures. Jakubowski, 2020. At Bridgewater, weekly truth process meetings uphold candor around weaknesses to drive individual and collective growth. Sinek, 2014. Providing venues where people feel safe exposing gaps and collaborating on improvements encourages vulnerability. Conclusion. Research conclusively shows that creating psychologically safe cultures where people feel secure being vulnerable and admitting limitations accelerates organizational learning, problem-solving, innovation, and performance. However, truly fostering environments embracing appropriate levels of respectful vulnerability requires conscious effort. Leaders must model this behavior, clearly define expected behaviors, align systems encouraging risk-taking without fear of punishment, and embed ongoing processes supporting development from failures and critical feedback. When done right through a sustained focus on people, processes, and systems, cultivating workforces comfortable with vulnerability can transform how organizations learn, improve, and compete.